Dragi obiskovalci našega YouTube kanala, dragi gledalci, moj današnji sogovornik je John Enyeart, ameriški profesor zgodovine na univerzi Bucknell v Pensilvaniji, ki se pri svojem delu ukvarja z različnimi vprašanji zgodovine, sodobne zgodovine, recimo kapitalizma, delavskih pravic, delavstva, imigracij, hladne vojne in tako naprej. Njegova knjiga, ki je bila na neke vrste, na nek način motiv za današnji pogovor o Louisu Adamiću in fašizmu, je v bistvu že pred časom izšla v slovenščini, natančneje leta 2020, pod naslovom Smrt fašizmu. In fašizem je ravno vsebina, o kateri bova danes govorila, oziroma bo naš sogovornik odgovoril na nekaj vprašanj. So, my first question, John, would be, how did Adamić encounter the question of fascism? Are his European roots and knowledge of the situation in Europe relevant here?
Yes, and again, thank you, Vala, for having me. Adamić first really starts writing about fascism around 1932, when he's returning to Slovenia for the first time since he'd left as a young boy, a teenager. And he is writing about how King Alexander is using these strong-arm gangster tactics that are starting to spread throughout Europe. And in particular, he stops in Italy on his way to Slovenia, to Yugoslavia, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And he writes a letter to his good friend, Kerry McWilliams, and he is astounded by just the atmosphere in Italy, where the young boys are firing out the fascist salute, where there's just this, as he describes it, this air of, terror and just menacing posture by all the Mussolini supporters toward anyone they see as foreign or challenging, and just the fervor of nationalism. And so he starts to explore this more and more, and you see it increasingly in his writings. And then the following year, once Hitler comes to power, he refers to Hitler as a gangster as well. So gangster is the metaphor he uses to describe fascists throughout Europe, and then increasingly in the United States.
So fascism, it was a political movement, it was a statehood system. But on the other hand, did he see that, or did he was aware that the fascism is also dangerous to the United States? Because fascism we very often just connect with the situation in Europe, like in Italy, or Nazism in Germany, or in Spain, probably, or even Portugal, for example. But what about states?
Yes.
How did he realize that in case of states?
Yes. I think it's important then as now to see fascism in multiple ways, right? And on the one hand, it can be a form of government, but before it becomes that, it's kind of, or it is a political culture, right? An expression by people who really want to use democracy or liberalism against itself to push their nationalists, anti-liberal, anti-Marxist, militaristic, totalitarian form of politics through violent police actions, extra-legal vigilante actions, and ultimately through the military, right? To impose a social hierarchy on those who belong and those who don't. And increasingly, what Adamić did was, as he interacted with different groups, especially Black Americans who were becoming more and more committed to anti-colonial views at the time, like W.E.B. Du Bois. So at the time, I mean the 1930s. Adamić starts to understand that there is a US version of fascism that Black people have been living under in the South through Jim Crow, through the Ku Klux Klan and those movements, and it is also, excuse me, merging that form of totalitarianism, which could be an inchoate fascism, is merging with a number of kind of pro-European fascist outlooks that exist in the United States. And I can tell you, a recent book came out about this, and this being, there was an effort by this guy, Gerald de Maguire, who was a Wall Street guy who goes and tours Europe, and he thinks Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal are moving the US toward communism, which was absurd, of course, but it's what he believed, similar to the Trump people and all their absurd uses of socialism and communism today, and they have no idea what they're talking about. And Maguire actually tries to raise an army to march on Washington, similar to Mussolini, right? And luckily, this former Marine General Smedley Butler exposes the plot, but enough people in Congress are tied to these Wall Street guys and the people who are in this movement that they don't want to be exposed, or they don't want to deal with it. And so there's a hearing in Congress, but they barely talk about it, and it's pushed aside as quickly as possible. And what's interesting is Adamić meets Butler. He has this newsletter later, and he writes about Butler and Butler's revelations on this. But I want to add one other thing. The group that Adamić is connected to, I mentioned Carrie McWilliams and some of these other writers. I mean, they're on the left, but they don't really, most of them don't belong to the Communist Party, and they're skeptical of the Socialist Party actually accomplishing anything. They sympathize with leftist ideals. They're not sure where they're going to head, and they mostly vote for Democrats, but they want the New Deal Democrats to go further to the left. They're writing about these conditions, and they see it increasingly, and you can read it in the pages of US magazines like The Nation and Harper's, where Adamić is writing, but also there's a Jewish immigrant named, well, his parents were immigrants. He's first generation US, I.F. Stone, who is, he said, look, when fascism comes to the United States, it's going to look like a Pennsylvania company town, right? Where the coal mines are able to hire their own police force, and the mine managers are also the mayor of the town. And you have this just utter form of totalitarianism that makes democracy a joke, right? The voting doesn't matter, although they claim to care about the institutions of democracy. Again, as I said earlier, they're perverting democracy for their own authoritarian ends, just to have the coal mined, and then, you know, you extrapolate that out. And as I already said, similar to the South, where you have white supremacy and this effort to, you know, keep Black people as sharecroppers and not allow them to get out of debt and things like that.
What did Adamić said about the praxis, which was very strange, for example, that fascists came on power, not in Italy, but in Germany, in Nazism, by elections. how did he explain that people voted for these kind of guys?
Right. I mean, and the same way we all do, he talks about how people are easily fooled. He didn't write about that too much, but you can extrapolate from how he wrote about anti-communists, right? Or how people buy into anti-communism, and it's that they're afraid to critique it, right? And so, because then they're afraid to be called a communist. And increasingly, as you get later in his life, he starts writing about how, you know, he gives this example: if the fireplace salesman tells you that it's going to be cold in the winter and tries to sell you a fireplace, and you don't want a fireplace, and you call him a liar for saying that it's going to be cold in the winter, you just can't make observations anymore, right? And he said, this is the absurdity of trying to talk about politics now with this growing fear. And he gets just into the fear that people have. And, you know, how he explains it is I think, again, he doesn't address it directly, but he would explain it, the indirect ways that he deals with it suggests the way he's explaining it is much like we explain it today, is one, some confusion, but two, just fear and ignorance, right? When you start to believe that some unnamed group of foreigners, or sometimes named but mischaracterized group of foreigners, are coming into your country to steal, you know, your systems of government and your healthcare and all of these types of things. You whip up the populace and they vote for national security or whatever nice sounding package of promises the politicians give you.
My next two questions will be much more about contemporary situation. Let's start with USA. You mentioned Maguire had an idea to march on Washington.
Right.
This reminds me very much to the kind of march to Congress, January 21, isn't it?
But I wouldn't just start there, right? I mean, that's kind of it's serious, and we need to take it seriously how many people are going to believe in that. But unfortunately, I think too many people are dismissing that as simply absurd, and see that the Trump people aren't that numerous. They're bigger than people thought. They had connections to government leaders and people in power more than people had thought. But, you know, ultimately, they weren't big enough or serious enough or had a good enough plan to do anything truly threatening to the Republic. But I think you have to move back, and I think it's been really Black leftists in the United States who've captured it most, starting with Du Bois, and people who've had international outlooks who agree with him. And then in the 1970s, you see Angela Davis and George Jackson, and then recently a geographer, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and some other people writing similarly to her, talk about the US's carceral state, and how you had an American version of fascism with Jim Crow, how we've never broken that, how it's taken on a new form in terms of the carceral state. And then back to your point, some of those other aspects are still there about nativism, anti-labor, anti-leftist politics. I mean, I live in a country where I mean, Bernie Sanders would be a moderate in Europe, right? And really, he's just a New Deal Democrat. And the fact that he's called, you know, a socialist or far left or something along those lines because he wants people to have health care is absurd. And so you see where the US is in terms of its political thought, where these far-right Trump people can be taken seriously as political candidates and even win, right? And when they don't win, enough people can believe that the elections were manipulated by the minority group, right? And this is how they get in power. Then yes, I think we have to be afraid, but I think we need to be more afraid, as I was suggesting, that the carceral state has existed for a very long time and really defines a central piece of American politics. And with that, we are seeing increasing efforts at popular mobilization, and this is where I think where January 6th, the real lesson is, popular mobilization against liberal institutions. And then too many people who vote for the Democrats in this country aren't afraid enough of fascism. They still believe, oh, look, the institutions are still functioning. They still make appeals. There must be good Republicans out there who still stand up for the institutions and the political culture and the Constitution. And we're at a point, look at our Supreme Court just overturned abortion not too long ago. I mean, that's embarrassing to live in a country where that this could even be discussed, let alone be made illegal, depending on the states. And you have politicians who don't even understand the health consequences of that. We don't need to get into that, but I'm using it as an example of a supposed democratic movement that leads to anti-democratic or illiberal laws to punish women, and we disproportionately punish Black people in this country. And so the hierarchy, there's an attempt to preserve the hierarchy through force if necessary and through extra legal force if necessary. And that's why I think it's important to call it fascism. I mean, one of the debates in this country right now is who cares if it's fascism or not? It's authoritarianism. And on one level, okay, whatever, we need to fight it and challenge it. But why I think it's important to see it as fascism is, look, fascism isn't just a historical moment. It's a type of thinking, as I keep saying, which is to have a mass mobilization against liberal politics while using that form to advance your agenda and use violence, extra legal violence if necessary, to maintain the hierarchy. And that's what we're seeing. So that's why I think we should call it that, because it also raises the threat level. You know what I mean? This is what its proponents are after, even if they can't always define it that way. But that's the logical conclusion to this.
So my next question is, for example, very interesting from our point of view, because it's the case that in the United States, something like social democratic policy, it's not vivid or even not existing. But the same was in Adamić time, and it is now. As you explained, in the Adamić times, and now these right wings guys also are on the same level, on the same positions, on the same ideas. So why there is not such a social democratic movement in USA? Okay, there are unions, but they are also not very strong unions like in Europe. But so there is liberal policy, and there is something right from the liberal. something what's going a little bit left from the liberal is already described as a communism, not from the McCarthy's time, but even before and now too.
Yeah, I think, well, we did have versions of it. It was limited to certain places, certain states where you could pass state laws. You know, right now you're seeing healthcare for children in California and New York. So you do see pockets of it. You do see instances of it. One of the problems is even when you get the legislation passed, so if you want to labor laws or environmental laws, the agencies that are to inspect and then fine and punish the corporations or individuals who violate those laws are quite weak. They lack the number of people to go out and do those inspections. For instance, you know, the mines in the United States are all very dangerous from what we keep seeing, and we have cave-ins, and you know, whenever there's an inspector, he'll write up this report, but it'll be ignored until the cave-in happens. And it's, you know, this is this is a centerpiece of debate. So I think in this country, after the 60s, we moved further and further to the right. The McCarthyism you referenced never quite went away, but it was held at bay. And then really beginning with Reagan, but certainly with those who were supposed to be on the left, like it was Bill Clinton who gutted welfare, right? And there's just this lack of empathy, frankly, in this country where, you know, you don't have it in your country or in other European countries. And this, I had a discussion once with, when I lived in Ljubljana for a year, with one of your philosophers, and during our discussion, he said, look, it's quite simple. You don't believe that the government should help people, and we believe that the government should give us health care. I mean, we can start there. And, you know, I agree with that. I was learning Italian once, and my roommate, the guy who let me rent a room in his apartment, he said, you Americans are such nationalists, but you don't take care of each other. Why won't you let each other have medicine? And I said, that's a great question. I agree with you 100%. And it, you know, it's become so ingrained in so many people that either you can't change the system, or that capitalism is deeply flawed, but the only way it remains the best system. And, you know, you see images of Venezuela, or, you know, they'll pick a place, even mainstream media, but right-wing media will pick places and talk about how terrible things are. But to be clear, when polls are taken, most Americans favor healthcare, for instance. Most Americans think abortion should be legal. And this gets us back to some of your questions, which are, how do minority positions that try to maintain the hierarchy keep winning? Well, people keep getting manipulated. They'll vote for the most conservative candidate for some kind of not well articulated nationalist perspective, without fully recognizing the rights that this person is going to take away from them if they can. So, I mean, that's part of it. Part of it are people really buy into notions of means testing, which, there's this phrase that you constantly hear in the US that people have to have skin in the game, and you won't be committed to this, and this being whatever the program is. You should pay into welfare so that if you need it later, that's okay because you've paid into it, versus the idea that you should give somebody a helping hand, or here we have inflation. Wouldn't rent control be a good idea? No, too bad, get a better job. Well, how is that supposed to happen? So I'm ultimately saying I don't know, but I am telling you the programs that you have in European countries, if you go issue by issue, pull well in the United States. But whenever a candidate like Bernie Sanders or somebody like that runs, you'll see a groundswell of support, but then you'll see both of the mainstream parties here attack that person and say that their ideas go too far, or are a threat in communism or socialism, which people don't even know how to define. So part of the answer is historical amnesia, fear, not recognizing. Part of it's nationalism, right? People in this country are told constantly we have the best healthcare system in the world, and the answer, one good answer to that is if you can afford it.
Yes.
So it's part of it's media manipulation, hyper nationalism. We could do a whole day discussion on this.
Let's go back to the Europe for last question. In last few presidential elections in France, Marine Le Pen was always the second one. Okay, she never won, but this means something that she was the second one. And almost day by day, precisely on 100th anniversary, in Italy, a neo-fascist party came back on power, now not by marching on Rome, but the elections. So how do you see the neo-fascism, rise of neo-fascism in Europe?
I'm sure you and the others where you work and the other scholars throughout Europe understand this far better than I do. Just as somebody who, lived a year in Slovenia and has been to Europe many times, and then looking at it across the ocean, I'm just afraid of it, right? I mean, Orban can be this popular that, I still just find it sad that that enough Slovenes voted for Janša, and then Le Pen, as you say, I mean it's kind of a joke. It isn't. She keeps coming in second, so there's a scare, but and then Italy, you actually see the spread. So I do think it's a transnational movement, right? Bolsonaro. And then you see moments of hope, like the Chilean constitution. We'll see what ultimately happens with that. Obviously, Trump here. But I don't know. I mean, part of it, as I said, you know better than me, part of it is an increasing fear of more refugees, which is going to happen with climate crises. I mean, they're really starting to show up now. It's just going to get worse. And I think enough Europeans, I don't know what the number would be, don't fully grasp or are unwilling to understand their legacy of colonialism and what that means, right? And why people who don't have the same resources would come to the metropole from their former colonizer, depending, I mean, if we're talking about France. So what do I think about it? I think it's scary. I think it's going to keep happening. I think the fear of migrants, and really, as long as capitalism continues to polarize wealth, and until we have some redistributive measures, we're going to keep seeing neo-fascists able to play on people's fears. And I mean, I wish I could be more profound than that, but that's how I see it.
Definitely, you should be aware of it.
Yeah.
John, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.